Welcome to the Unveiled Epikeko's channel. Today, we're diving deep into an unexplored historical mystery. Imagine, if you will, the soft rustle of parchment in a dimly lit room in Colonial, Virginia, sometime in the late spring of 1712, when the air carried the faint scent of tobacco leaves drying in the sun and the distant, gentle lapping of the James River against its banks. The colony was quiet that day, as it often was, with folks going about their daily routines in no particular hurry, tending to fields of corn and wheat, mending fences that didn't need much mending, and gathering in small groups to discuss matters that seemed important at the time, but would fade gently into the background of history like mist over the water in the early morning. In the governor's modest council chamber in Williamsburg, a room with heavy oak beams and a fireplace that crackled softly even on warmer days, because someone always thought it added a touch of comfort. A handful of men sat around a long table covered in maps and documents that had been unfolded, and refolded so many times the creases were as familiar as old friends. There was Governor Alexander, a man of steady habits who enjoyed his pipe after meals and preferred conversations that meandered rather than rushed, alongside Clerk Edmund, whose handwriting was neat and deliberate, taking his time with every quill stroke as if the ink might run out if he hurried, and Surveyor William, who had a habit of adjusting his spectacles every few minutes while peering at lines on paper that sometimes blurred together in the candlelight. They were there to review a new land grant, one of many that came across the table in those years, petitioned by a group of settlers from the northern parts of the colony who had heard tales of fertile ground farther west, though no one was in any great rush to confirm those tales firsthand. The map before them was a large one, drawn by a cartographer in London who had never set foot in Virginia, but relied on reports sent back across the ocean, reports that were often second or third hand and included sketches made hastily during brief expeditions. On this particular map, the coastline of the Atlantic Ocean was rendered in a sweeping curve of blue ink, with little waves drawn along the edge to indicate water, and just inland from that, vast areas shaded in pale green to suggest land suitable for farming, though the shading sometimes spilled over in places where the ink had been applied a bit too generously. As the governor leaned forward, puffing slowly on his pipe, he traced a finger along one section of the map and remarked in a low, even tone that perhaps the boundary line for this new grant could extend all the way to the eastern edge, where the green met the blue, because there seemed to be plenty of space marked as arable. Clerk nodded thoughtfully, dipping his quill into the inkwell and making a small note in the margin of the petition, observing that the description in the original request mentioned lands bordering the Great Eastern Sea, which sounded reasonable enough given how maps sometimes things for clarity. Surveyor adjusted his spectacles once more and suggested they compare it to an older map from the previous decade, which he pulled from a stack in the corner, unfolding it carefully so as not to tear the brittle paper. And there too the blue and green blended in a way that could be interpreted as transitional, perhaps a marshy area or low-lying fields prone to flooding, but still workable with proper drainage ditches dug over the course of several unhurried seasons. They discussed this for a while, passing the maps back and forth, with pauses to refill pipes or sip from cups of weak tea that had cooled to just the right temperature for lingering, and no one raised their voice or felt the need to resolve the matter quickly, because there were always more days ahead for such decisions. In the weeks that followed, the grant was approved in much the same calm manner, with the paperwork in triplicate, once for the colonial records, once for the petitioners, and once for the files in London that might be reviewed someday when someone across the ocean had the time. And the description included phrases like extending to the waters of the Eastern Ocean, inclusive of lands therein marked as tillable, which seemed precise enough at the time. The settlers, a quiet group of families from around Jamestown who preferred steady work to adventure, received their documents with polite thanks and began making slow preparations, packing wagons with tools and seeds over the course of many leisurely afternoons, discussing among themselves how the new farmland would provide for generations without any need for haste. Meanwhile, back in the council chamber, similar meetings continued on other matters, like the placement of a new mill along a creek that flowed lazily through the countryside, or the allocation of quotas for tobacco exports that year, with the same gentle backhand forth of opinions, minor corrections to ledgers, and the occasional observation about the weather being particularly mild. Time passed in this way, as it does in places where the days blend softly into one another, with letters arriving from England confirming the grant without question, because the maps sent along looked official enough, and reports coming in from the settlers describing their progress in clearing what they believed to be exceptionally wide fields near the coast, though they noted the soil was unusually salty and required extra plowing that could be done gradually. No one thought much of the oddity at first, attributing it to natural variations in the land, and the bureaucratic correspondence continued in its soothing rhythm, with replies drafted carefully and sent off on ships that sailed when the winds were favorable. And so the colony carried on, with its quiet routines and gentle confusions, the map mistake lingering like a forgotten dream in the archives, fading softly into the long, peaceful flow of years. And so the seasons turned gently in the Virginia colony, with summer giving way to a long, mild autumn, where the leaves on the oaks and maples drifted down in no great hurry, carpeting the paths around Williamsburg in shades of red and gold that crunched softly underfoot, as clerks and council members made their unhurried way to and from the Capitol building each day. The land grant to the eastern fields continued to be worked in the same steady, deliberate fashion, with the families who had settled there rising early, but without alarm, tending to rows of corn and barley that struggled a little more than expected against the persistent dampness, and the occasional high tide that lapped farther inland than anyone remembered from previous years, though they simply adjusted by planting a bit higher up and waiting patiently for the water to recede, as it always did in time. Letters traveled back and forth between the settlement and the governor's office, carried on wagons that rolled along rutted roads at a comfortable pace, and those letters spoke mostly of routine matters: the need for additional iron plows, the quality of the harvest, which was adequate if not abundant, and small requests for clarification on boundary markers that had been placed some years earlier and were now half covered in drifting sand. Governor would read these missives in the late afternoon, seated by the window where sunlight filtered through in a warm, golden haze, and he would dictate replies to clerk in a low, measured voice, suggesting that the markers be reset when convenient, and that perhaps a new survey could be arranged in the coming spring, weather permitting and schedules allowing. No one felt any pressing concern. The ocean, after all, was simply there, vast and calm most days, its waves rolling in with the same rhythmic patience as everything else in the colony. Surveyor, on his occasional visits to the coast to check other holdings, would pause to gaze out over the water and note in his journal, in careful, looping script, that the horizon appeared unusually broad this season, and that the soil near the shore had a peculiar sheen when the sun struck it just so. But he attributed these observations to the play of light and the natural variations one encountered when maps were drawn from afar. Back in the council chamber, meetings carried on much as before, with the long table still covered in papers that accumulated slowly, layer upon layer, and discussions drifting from one topic to the next: the price of indigo, the maintenance of the road to Norfolk, the proper storage of official seals, so that the matter of the Eastern grant became just one more familiar item mentioned in passing, nodded to, and set aside for future consideration. Years slipped by in this quiet rhythm, with children growing up along the widened shore, learning to read from the same maps their parents had relied upon, and accepting without question that their fields extended generously toward the great Eastern Sea, which provided fish in abundance and a cooling breeze on warmer evenings. Ships from England continued to arrive at regular intervals, unloading goods and passengers who remarked in mild wonder at how close the cultivated land seemed to come to the water's edge. But such comments were met with polite agreement and offers of refreshment, and soon enough the newcomers settled into the same gentle pace of life. The paperwork, of course, steadily: new deeds referencing the original grant, tax assessments based on acreage that included areas now gently submerged at high tide, correspondence with London that crossed the ocean and returned months later with approvals stamped in red wax, and all of it was filed away in cabinets that creaked softly when opened, the ink fatting just a little more with each passing season. And still the days unfolded slowly, with morning mists lifting gradually over the water that everyone called farmland, afternoon meals taken at leisure, and evenings spent in quiet conversation by hearth fires that glowed low and steady, while outside the Atlantic breathed in and out against the shore in its eternal, unhurried way, keeping its own patient counsel on the small misunderstanding recorded so carefully on old parchment long ago. As the years continued their gentle drift into the 1720s, the colony of Virginia settled even deeper into its familiar rhythms, with mornings beginning softly under a pale sky that brightened slowly over the broad fields and the wide, shimmering expanse that everyone still referred to, in official documents and casual conversation alike, as the Eastern farmlands. New families arrived from England and from neighboring colonies, drawn by the promise of generous acreage at reasonable, and they were welcomed with quiet handshakes and offers of temporary lodging, while they selected their plots from the remaining sections marked on the ever maps that now yellowed gently at the edges. The settlement along the coast grew in an unhurried way, with cabins built one board at a time when the weather was fair and the lumber had seasoned properly, fences erected in straight but forgiving lines that allowed for slight adjustments as the ground shifted imperceptibly with the tides, and small wharves constructed more for convenience in fishing than for any grand commerce, since the harvests of wheat and oats, though modest, provided enough for local needs and a little surplus to send inland on flatboats that floated downstream at whatever speed the current allowed. In Williamsburg, the council continued to meet on appointed days, usually the second Tuesday of each month unless rain made the roads too soft for easy travel, and the topic of the eastern farmlands would surface now, and then amid longer discussions about ferry licenses or the proper width of public roads, with someone nodding that tax receipts from the area were steady, if not spectacular, and that perhaps a more detailed survey should be commissioned, when the surveyor's office had fewer pressing commitments elsewhere. Clerk, whose hair had grayed only slightly at the temples over the decade, would make a careful entry in the ledger to that effect, underlining it once for emphasis but not twice, as twice might suggest urgency, and then the conversation would drift naturally to the quality of this year's apple crop or the need to repair the roof on the magazine before winter set in. Letters from the settlers arrived with comforting regularity, written in plain, patient hands, describing the planting of new orchards that took well in the higher ground, the mending of nets after storms that came and went without much fuss, and occasional requests for additional boundary stones to replace those that had settled deeper into the sand over time, requests that were approved in due course with seals affixed and copies retained in folders that grew thicker year by year. Surveyor, now spending more evenings by his own fireside compiling notes for a history he worked on in small increments, would sometimes reflect aloud to visitors that the coastline seemed to have a remarkably gradual slope in that region, allowing for extensive cultivation right up to the water's edge, a feature he considered fortunate rather than peculiar, and worthy of only a brief mention in his writings. Ships sailing along the coast bound for Philadelphia or Boston would pass by the settlement at a comfortable distance, their captains nodding in logs the unusual sight of plowed fields extending so near the surf, and the faint smoke rising from chimneys that appeared almost at the shoreline. But such observations were filed away with remarks about wind direction and water depth, and rarely prompted further inquiry. Governors came and went in the usual orderly fashion, eventually returning to England with measured satisfaction at his tenure, succeeded by men who approached the office with the same calm diligence. And each new administration inherited the same stacks of papers, the same maps with their softly blended colors, and the same quiet acceptance that the eastern farmlands were simply part of the colony's broad and bountiful landscape, worked steadily by families who rose with the sun, rested when the light faded, and passed their days in the gentle repetition of seasons that arrived and departed without announcement or fanfare, while the great ocean beyond continued its slow, endless breathing against the quiet edge of what everyone agreed, in the most peaceful and unquestioning way, was very fine farmland indeed. By the middle of the 1730s, the eastern farmlands had become so thoroughly woven into the ordinary fabric of Virginia life that few people, even those who traveled regularly along the coast road, paused to consider how remarkably extensive the cultivated ground appeared to stretch toward the horizon, where the plowed rows seemed to dissolve gently into the pale blue haze that hung over the water on most calm mornings. New generations of children grew up accepting without question that their family holdings included broad sections regularly refreshed by the sea's quiet advance and retreat, and they learned early to time their planting around the lunar tides in the same way their grandparents had adjusted for rainfall farther inland. All of it done with the same unhurried patience that governed every other task in the colony. In Williamsburg, the council records continued to accumulate in their quiet way, with annual reports from the sheriff of the coastal district noting tax payments received in full and on time, accompanied by small notations about the occasional need to relocate a boundary post after particularly high waters, changes that were approved routinely with a brief minute entered in the margin and initialed by whichever clerk happened to be at the desk that day. Successive governors, each settling into the comfortable chair once occupied by, would occasionally review the older maps during slow afternoons when little else demanded attention, tracing the familiar sweep of green shading that flowed so generously eastward, and they would nod thoughtfully before setting the parchment aside to attend to more immediate concerns, such as the placement of a new courthouse or the regulation of ordinaries along the main roads. Correspondence with the Board of Trade in London followed its established pattern, with packets of documents sent across the ocean every few months containing copies of grants, assessments, and surveys that all referred matter-of-factly to the productive acreage bordering the Eastern Sea, and the replies that eventually returned expressed mild satisfaction at the steady expansion of settlement, without ever requesting clarification on details that seemed perfectly clear from the accompanying charts. Clerks came and went in the secretary's office, each learning the routines from their predecessors: how to fold letters into precise thirds, how to space entries evenly in the great leather-bound volumes, how to brew tea strong enough to last through long sessions of copying. And the files concerning the eastern farmlands simply grew thicker, their contents read and referenced as needed, but never with any sense that something might be amiss amid the soothing repetition of official phrases. Out along the shore itself, the community carried on in its gentle rhythm, with barns raised communally over the course of several pleasant weekends, quilting bees held in the larger cabins during the cooler months, and Sunday services conducted beneath shady oaks where the congregation could hear the soft murmur of waves in the background like a distant hymn. Fishing supplemented the crops in seasons when the soil proved less cooperative, and the catch was shared without formality among neighbors who had known one another for years, and whose conversations tended toward observations about the weather or the health of livestock, rather than anything that might disturb the calm flow of days. Travelers passing through on their way north or south would sometimes stop overnight at one of the modest inns that had sprung up to serve coastal traffic, and over simple suppers of corn bread and salted ham, they would listen to local folks speak of their fields with quiet pride, remarking on the fine view across the water, and the convenience of having both tillable land and abundant seafood so close at hand. Comments that were received with polite agreement, and perhaps an offer of another helping before everyone retired early to beds that creaked softly under hand-stitched quilts. And thus the decades continued their slow, undisturbed passage, with the great Atlantic rolling patiently in and out along the edge of what was marked on every official map as prime colonial farmland, its vastness accepted as naturally as the turning of seasons or the gradual aging of the oak beams in the Capitol building back in Williamsburg, where the ledgers and maps rested quietly in their drawers, waiting for the next unhurried hand to turn their pages when the time felt right. As the 1740s unfolded with their customary quiet grace across the Virginia landscape, the eastern farmlands entered a period of even deeper settlement, where the routines of daily life had become so thoroughly ingrained that they required little thought or discussion beyond the gentle exchange of pleasantries over fence rails, or during pauses in the fields when the sun climbed high enough to warrant a moment's rest beneath the shade of a lone cedar. Families now in their third or fourth generation along the shore spoke of their holdings with the same calm assurance their forebears had shown, pointing out to visitors the distant lines where their plowed ground met the pale shimmer of water on clear days, and explaining in soft, unhurried voices how the soil in the lower sections benefited from the natural fertilization provided by the sea's regular visits. A circumstance they had long since adapted to with raised beds and careful timing of seed sowing that varied only slightly from year to year. In Williamsburg, the great ledgers in the secretary's office continued to receive their steady additions, with entries recording the transfer of parcels from father to son upon coming of age, or the division of larger tracts among siblings who preferred to remain close rather than seek new ground farther west. All of it documented in the same careful script that had been passed down through successive clerks who took pride in maintaining consistency across decades of quiet administration. Governors during this time, men like William, whose long tenure brought a particular stability to proceedings, would occasionally sign batches of routine patents that included renewed confirmation of the original Eastern grants, affixing the colonial seal with a measured press that left a perfect impression in the warm wax, and then setting the documents aside for copying and filing, while conversation turned to milder topics such as the progress of the new parish church or the scheduling of the next public fair. Maps, now reproduced in greater numbers to accommodate the growing bureaucracy, continued to show the same generous sweep of green extending eastward, with the blue of the ocean rendered in lighter shades along the margin, as if to suggest a gradual transition rather than a firm boundary. An artistic choice that no one in the colony thought to question, since it matched so closely what they observed from their porches each morning and evening. Correspondence with London remained comfortably predictable, with dispatches sent off on schedule detailing population increases in the coastal districts and modest rises in agricultural output, accompanied by updated charts that were reviewed briefly in Whitehall offices before being placed in drawers alongside thousands of similar reports from other colonies, none of which prompted any particular comment or request for further detail. Along the shore itself, the community deepened its quiet roots, with new cabins rising slowly beside older ones whose logs had weathered to a soft silver gray, orchards of peach and apple spreading across the higher ground, where the fruit hung heavy in late summer and was picked at leisure over the course of many warm afternoons, and small graveyards established beneath clusters of oaks, where generations rested side by side beneath stones, carved with simple names and dates that spoke of long, peaceful lives. Church services moved indoors to a modest meeting house built with communal labor over several seasons. Its benches filled each Sunday with families dressed in their best homespun who listened to sermons delivered in measured tones about patience and stewardship of the land, while through the open windows came the familiar, soothing sound of waves rolling gently against the broad fields beyond. Travelers along the coastal post road grew accustomed to the sight of extensive cultivation reaching so near the water's edge, and many paused to water their horses at streams that flowed lazily eastward, accepting without surprise the offers of cool cider from nearby farms and lingering in conversation about crop prospects or the best routes northward before continuing on their way at an easy pace. Tax collectors making their annual rounds found the district remarkably cooperative, with payments tendered in coin or produce according to long-standing custom, and their reports back to the capital noted only the usual small adjustments for parcels temporarily inundated after storms, adjustments that were recorded and forgotten in the same motion. And so the years drifted onward into the 1750s, with the eastern farmlands remaining an unremarkable yet deeply settled part of the colonial tapestry, its vastness accepted as naturally as the wide sky above or the slow turning of seasons that brought spring rains, summer heat, autumn harvest, and winter rest in gentle succession, while the great ocean beyond continued its patient, rhythmic breathing along the quiet edge of what every map and ledger calmly affirmed was simply very extensive, very peaceful farmland. As the 1750s gave way to the gentler rhythms of the 1760s, the eastern farmlands settled into an even deeper sense of permanence, where the boundaries between cultivated ground and the quiet expanse of water had blurred so thoroughly in daily life that no one bothered to distinguish them with any precision beyond the practical needs of planting and harvesting. Families now traced their connection to the original grants through great-grandparents whose names appeared in fading ink on the oldest patents, still carefully preserved in cedar chests, or passed down as heirlooms alongside quilts and silver spoons. And young couples setting up their own households would select parcels from the remaining higher sections with the same calm deliberation their elders had always shown. Marking out new fields with wooden stakes driven in at leisure over several afternoons, while neighbors stopped by to offer quiet advice on drainage or the best varieties of tobacco for the saltier soil nearer the shore. In Williamsburg, the council chamber saw its familiar routines continue unchanged, with meetings convened on schedule and minutes recorded in the same even hand that had documented proceedings for decades, nodding in passing the steady increase in population along the eastern districts, and the reliable payment of that arrived, bundled with the usual accompanying letters expressing mild satisfaction with the fertility of the land, despite its occasional need for extra manuring after heavier tides. Successive clerks, trained patiently by their retiring predecessors, learned to copy the long-established descriptions of boundaries without alteration extending eastward to the Great Sea and inclusive of all tillable ground therein, and to file the resulting documents in the appropriate drawers, where they joined generations of similar papers, gathering the faint scent of aged parchment and pipe smoke that lingered in the room. Governors during these years approached their duties with the same measured pace, reviewing stacks of routine petitions during quiet mornings when the light through the windows fell softly across the table, and approving minor adjustments to assessments or the issuance of new patents with a signature that flowed smoothly across the page before the quill was wiped clean and set aside for the next task. Maps circulated among officials and settlers alike continued to reflect the broad, uninterrupted sweep of green shading that merged so naturally into the pale blue beyond. And when new copies were commissioned from local draftsmen who worked from the Colonial originals, the same generous proportions were preserved without question, the cartographers simply tracing the familiar lines in fresh ink that dried slowly in the humid air. Out along the shore, the community deepened its quiet traditions, with annual harvests celebrated in modest gatherings where tables were spread beneath shady trees and conversation flowed easily about the prospects for the coming season or recollections of past years, when the crops had been particularly fine, all of it accompanied by the constant, soothing murmur of waves against the wide fields that stretched farther than memory in either direction. Fishing remained a steady supplement, with boats launched and retrieved at convenient times rather than fixed hours, their catches smoked or salted in sheds built sturdy against the salt air, and shared among households in the same spirit of neighborly ease that governed every other exchange. Travelers on the post road grew ever more accustomed to the remarkable breadth of cultivation visible from the higher points along the route, and many made a habit of pausing at familiar wayside springs to rest and water their mounts, while accepting the customary offers of shade and conversation from nearby farms, lingering just long enough to enjoy the view across the seemingly endless plowed ground that met the horizon in a soft haze of blue and green before continuing onward without hurry. Tax rolls lengthened gradually with each passing year, incorporating new names and adjusted acreages that reflected the slow subdivision of larger holdings among growing families. And the collectors who rode the circuit found the same courteous reception they had always known, with accounts settled over cups of cider or small beer, while discussion touched lightly on the mildness of the weather or the health of children and livestock. Church attendance remained steady in the meeting house, whose whitewashed walls had weathered gently over time, with sermons delivered in calm, familiar cadences that encouraged contentment with one's portion and careful stewardship of the bountiful land the Lord had provided, while through the open doors drifted the eternal, quiet breathing of the sea against the vast fields it nourished in its own patient way. And thus the colony moved serenely through the later years of the decade, with the eastern farmlands woven so completely into the quiet pattern of life that they required no special notice or remark, existing simply as the broad, peaceful heart of coastal settlement, where generations lived and worked and rested in the gentle, unchanging rhythm of days that blended softly one into another beneath the wide Virginia sky. As the 1770s dawned softly over the Virginia colony, bringing with them the same familiar pattern of mild winters giving way to gentle springs, where dogwood and redbud bloomed in quiet profusion along the lanes and hedgerows, the eastern farmlands continued their serene existence as an unquestioned cornerstone of coastal life, with fields stretching broad and uninterrupted toward the hazy line where sky and water met on most days in a seamless blend of pale colors. The community had grown comfortably larger over the previous decades, yet without any sense of crowding or haste, as new households simply established themselves a little farther along the shore in either direction, clearing ground at a measured pace that allowed trees to be felled and stumps removed over the course of several seasons, while crops were rotated thoughtfully to maintain the soil's quiet productivity. Children born in the later years of the previous century now raised families of their own, passing along the same patient methods of farming that accounted for the regular inundations of the lower sections, planting corn and pumpkins on slightly raised ridges, reserving the flattest ground for salt meadow hay that thrived naturally with the sea's gentle nourishment, and speaking of the vast eastern fields with the easy familiarity of people who had never known anything different. In Williamsburg, the routines of governance carried on in their soothing, predictable way, with the council assembling as usual in the capital's upper chamber where sunlight slanted through tall windows in the afternoons, and members reviewed the customary lists of petitions, tax reports, and land transfers that included, without any special notation, the steady stream of documents from the coastal districts confirming continued settlement and cultivation of the broad acreage originally granted so many decades earlier. Clerks in the secretary's office, now several generations removed from those who had first recorded the mistaken boundaries, continued to copy descriptions verbatim from older patents into new ones, their quills moving steadily across fresh sheets of paper that smelled faintly of the rag content, and the size used to give them body, while conversation in the room paused occasionally for the pouring of tea or the adjustment of a window sash to catch the breeze. Maps hanging on the walls or rolled in cabinets retained the same generous proportions that had become traditional, with the green shading flowing eastward in a wide, comforting sweep that no one present had ever thought to measure against direct observation from the shore, since such observation matched so closely what the charts depicted. Correspondence across the Atlantic maintained its calm rhythm, with packets dispatched on merchant vessels that sailed when fully laden and winds favorable, containing the usual summaries of provincial affairs that mentioned the eastern farmlands only in aggregate figures of population and production, figures that drew no particular attention in London offices already burdened with reports from multiple colonies stretching along the entire coast. Along the shore itself, daily life deepened into an even richer tapestry of quiet custom, with mornings beginning with the soft calls of gulls overhead and the distant murmur of waves against the wide plowed ground, afternoons spent in steady labor broken by pauses to rest in the shade of porches where rocking chairs creaked gently, and evenings bringing families together around tables laden with simple plenty, fish chowder thickened with potatoes, cornbread baked in iron skillets, greens gathered from kitchen gardens, while lamplight flickered softly, and stories were shared in low voices about grandparents who had first come to claim their portions of the great eastern sea's bounty. Communal tasks such as barn or the annual dredging of small drainage channels were accomplished over many pleasant days, with neighbors working side by side in no particular rush, pausing frequently for refreshment and conversation that touched lightly on the mildness of the season or the promising stand of wheat in the upper fields. Sunday worship in the meeting house, now enlarged with an addition built slowly over several years, drew the full community in their Sunday best, with hymns sung in measured harmony and sermons reminding all to be thankful for the broad and fertile land that stretched so generously before them, a gift accepted with quiet gratitude and no need for further explanation. Travelers along the improving post road, now graded and graveled in sections for smoother passage, continued to remark inwardly on the remarkable extent of cultivation visible from higher points. Yet such remarks rarely found their way into letters or journals beyond mild notes about the prosperity of the lower counties, and the fine views afforded across the water from roadside inns, where overnight guests were treated to the same hospitable ease that characterized every interaction. Tax assessments and collections proceeded with the customary cooperation, sheriffs and deputies riding the familiar circuits at a comfortable pace, and settling accounts over long conversations that allowed time for news from Williamsburg or inquiries about mutual acquaintances before riding on to the next farmstead. And so the years of the early 1770s drifted gently onward, with the eastern farmlands remaining deeply embedded in the peaceful rhythm of colonial existence, their vastness as natural and unquestioned as the slow rise and fall of tides that nourished the broad fields everyone simply called home. As the middle years of the 1770s drifted quietly onward beneath skies that shifted softly from the pale blues of spring to the deeper hazes of summer, and then to the golden light of autumn, the eastern farmlands remained a steadfast and unremarkable fixture in the daily lives of those who called them home, with vast fields stretching serenely toward the endless shimmer of water that everyone continued to regard as the natural limit of their fertile ground. Generations now overlapped in comfortable harmony along the shore, with elders seated on porches in the cooler evenings, sharing measured recollections of earlier plantings and harvests, while younger folk tended to the evening chores, milking cows that grazed contentedly on the salt meadow grass, mending fences that needed only minor straightening after the occasional breeze, drawing water from wells that rarely ran low thanks to the steady moisture in the soil. And all of it done without any sense of rush or concern, beyond the gentle rhythm of light and season. In Williamsburg, the Capitol building stood as solidly as ever, its brick walls warmed by decades of sun, and within its chambers the council proceeded through its appointed sessions with the same calm deliberation that had marked every administration since the colony's earlier days, reviewing ledgers that recorded the quiet prosperity of the coastal districts in neat columns of figures showing consistent yields of grain and hay, steady births and marriages, and paid in full with only the customary small notes about parcels temporarily affected by higher waters that were soon restored to productivity. Clerks moved through their tasks with practiced ease, copying patents and proclamations in the familiar looping script that filled page after page of the great volumes lined along the shelves, pausing now and then to sharpen a quill or stretch after long hours bent over the desk, while the soft ticking of a tall clock in the corner marked the slow passage of afternoon into evening. Maps consulted during these sessions retained their long-accepted outlines, with the broad green expanse flowing eastward in the same reassuring proportions that had been traced and retraced across countless copies, and no one present felt any inclination to question the generous boundaries, since reports from the sheriffs and receivers consistently affirmed the land's ongoing cultivation and improvement. Dispatches to London continued their regular crossings of the ocean, carried aboard ships that loaded tobacco and other staples at a leisurely pace in the lower rivers before setting sail when conditions were most favorable, and the enclosures detailing provincial affairs included the usual summaries of acreage under tillage in the eastern counties, without drawing any particular notice from officials occupied with broader matters of trade and governance. Along the shore, the community deepened its quiet traditions further, with quilting circles gathering in the warmer months beneath shady oaks to stitch patterns handed down through mothers and grandmothers. Harvest suppers spread on long tables outdoors, where platters of fried fish and roasted corn were passed in slow succession, accompanied by gentle laughter and stories retold in familiar cadence. And winter evenings, spent by hearth fires, where the glow reflected softly on faces intent on mending nets, or carving small wooden toys, for the children who listened wide-eyed to tales of the first settlers who had claimed such bountiful ground from the generous eastern sea. Fishing boats bobbed gently at their moorings, launched when the mood and weather aligned for a quiet day on the water that everyone still thought of as the farther edge of their fields, and the catch was brought ashore without fanfare to be cleaned and preserved in the same sheds that had served for generations. Travelers along the post road, now improved with occasional mile markers and better drainage, found the same welcoming inns and farmsteads offering rest and refreshment, with hosts who spoke proudly yet quietly of the broad lands that supported so many families in comfortable sufficiency, and guests who nodded in agreement while enjoying the view across the seemingly limitless plowed ground that met the horizon in a peaceful blend of earth and sky. Church services continued in the enlarged meeting house, its bell ringing softly across the fields each Sabbath morning to summon the community in orderly procession, with pews filled by folk in clean but simple attire who sang hymns in measured time, and listened to sermons on contentment and diligence delivered in tones that matched the gentle lapping of waves heard faintly through the windows. Tax collections proceeded as smoothly as ever, with deputies received hospitably at each doorstep, and accounts reviewed over shared meals that allowed ample time for local news and observations about the promising stands of wheat or the health of orchards before the next stop on the familiar circuit. And thus the later years of the 1770s passed in serene continuity, with the eastern farmlands woven ever more deeply into the quiet fabric of colonial existence, their vast and tranquil expanse accepted as naturally as the slow turning of seasons or the patient rhythm of tides that caressed the broad fields in endless, soothing repetition. As the final years of the 1770s eased quietly toward their close, with autumn leaves drifting slowly from the scattered oaks and hickories along the shore and winter tides rising just high enough to refresh the lower meadows without causing any undue inconvenience, the eastern farmlands carried on in their deeply familiar and untroubled way, supporting generation upon generation in the same gentle cycle of planting, tending, harvesting, and resting that had defined life there since the earliest grants were recorded so many decades before. The community now numbered many hundreds of souls spread comfortably along the broad coastal plain, with cabins and larger farmhouses dotting the landscape in loose clusters connected by winding lanes that followed the natural contours of the ground and allowed travelers to move at whatever pace suited the day or the weather. Daily routines remained soothingly repetitive, rising with the pale light that filtered across the wide fields from the east, breaking fast on johnny cakes and salt herring with strong coffee brewed slowly over banked coals, setting out to the fields or the boats with tools carried easily over one shoulder, pausing midday for a simple dinner taken in the shade or beside the hearth when rain showers passed gently overhead, and gathering again in the evening for supper and quiet conversation that rarely strayed beyond the immediate concerns of family, crops, livestock, and the ever-dependable patterns of wind and water. In Williamsburg, the machinery of colonial administration continued its measured turning, with the House of Burgesses convening in familiar session to debate matters of roads and ferries, tobacco inspection, and the maintenance of public buildings, while references to the eastern districts appeared only in the routine reading of committee reports that noted satisfactory revenue from the coastal counties and recommended no changes to existing assessments or boundaries. Clerks in the various offices moved through their appointed rounds with the calm efficiency born of long practice, entering new deeds and wills into the great books, copying correspondence for the governor's files, and sealing packets for the next vessel bound across the ocean, all of it accomplished amid the soft scratch of quills and the occasional creak of floorboards under deliberate footsteps. Maps consulted for any purpose retained the same broad and comforting outlines that had served without alteration for 3/4 of a century, their faded inks refreshed periodically by careful tracing that preserved every generous curve and sweep of green extending eastward to meet the pale wash of blue, in a transition so gradual it seemed entirely natural. Dispatches sent to London in these years followed the established pattern, summarizing provincial conditions in measured language that highlighted steady settlement and agricultural output, without drawing attention to any particular feature of the coastal landscape. And the responses that returned months later expressed general approval of the colony's management, before being filed away, with thousands of similar documents gathering quiet dust in Whitehall cabinets. Along the shore itself, the seasons turned with their customary gentleness, spring bringing soft rains that greened the fields almost overnight, summer offering long days of warm sun balanced by cooling breezes off the water, autumn painting the marshes in muted golds and russets before the harvest was gathered in unhurried rhythm, and winter settling in with occasional frosts that rarely lingered and fires built just high enough to take the chill from rooms where families gathered to mend clothes, shell beans for storage, or simply sit in companionable silence watching flames dance slowly behind the andirons. Communal life deepened in its quiet customs, with weddings celebrated in the meeting house followed by gatherings at the bride's family farm, where tables groaned gently under platters of roasted fowl and pies. Funerals conducted with the same solemn calm that marked every other occasion, and graves added to the small churchyard overlooking the broad fields. And regular visiting among neighbors that involved long afternoons of shared work, followed by equally long evenings of talk that circled familiar topics without ever needing resolution. Fishing continued as a steady and undemanding part of existence, with nets cast and drawn at convenient times, and the catch divided fairly among households that had long since ceased to distinguish strictly between what came from the soil and what came from the water everyone still thought of as the farther edge of their land. Travelers on the post road, whether local folk riding between settlements or strangers bound for points north or south, found the same hospitable reception at every doorstep, with offers of rest and refreshment extended without expectation of haste and conversation, lingering comfortably on subjects of weather, crops, and mutual acquaintances before farewells were spoken in the same unhurried tone. Tax and collections proceeded with the customary ease. Officials welcomed into kitchens for the settling of accounts over cider or small beer, while ledgers were consulted slowly, and payments counted out coin by coin or noted in produce to be delivered at the next convenient opportunity. And thus the closing years of the decade passed in serene and undisturbed continuity, with the eastern farmlands remaining as deeply and quietly integral to Virginia life as the slow rise of morning missed off the wide water, or the patient turning of seasons across the vast, tranquil expanse that every soul there simply accepted as their broad and bountiful home. As the first hints of the 1780s appeared on the horizon, with the soft of winter skis giving way to the tender greens of early spring pushing up through the broad fields refreshed by months of quiet tides, the eastern farmlands entered yet another decade of serene and unquestioned continuity, where the vast expanse of cultivated ground stretching eastward remained as much a part of daily existence as the air itself, breathed in and accepted without a moment's pause or wonder. The community along the shore had now grown into a loose but deeply connected chain of settlements extending many miles in either direction, with farmsteads separated by wide swaths of plowed land and pasture that blended imperceptibly into the pale shimmer of water on the farthest edge. And families traced their roots back through so many generations of patient tilling and harvesting that the original grants felt less like historical documents than like ancient family lore told softly around evening fires. Daily life unfolded in its soothing, unchanging pattern, mornings beginning with the gradual brightening of light across the endless fields, the low calls of cattle, and the distant murmur of waves that everyone still thought of as simply the farther boundary of their lower meadows. Breakfasts of mush and milk taken slowly at tables facing eastward windows. The steady rhythm of work through the daylight hours, whether in the fields with plow or hoe, or on the water with net and line. Midday rests beneath shady porches where lemonade or buttermilk was sipped in quiet companionship, and evenings bringing everyone together again for supper followed by the gentle routines of mending, reading from the family Bible, or simply sitting in rocking chairs that creaked softly while night settled over the broad land like a familiar quilt. In Williamsburg, though the political air had begun to carry faint whispers of discontent from other quarters, the routines of record-keeping and administration in the Capitol and secretaries' office proceeded with the same measured calm that had governed them for nearly a century, with clerks entering new land transfers and tax receipts from the coastal districts in the customary neat columns, nodding only in passing the continued subdivision of larger original parcels among heirs who preferred to remain close to the broad eastern fields their ancestors had claimed so long ago. Maps consulted for routine purposes, whether to settle a minor boundary dispute between neighbors or to update the great chart hung in the governor's council chamber, preserved the same generous sweep of green shading flowing eastward into the pale blue margin, their lines traced and retraced so many times that the original mistake had become indistinguishable from established truth, accepted by every hand that held the quill or rolled the parchment. Correspondence with authorities across the ocean, though increasingly delayed and uncertain in these years, still followed the old patterns when it was sent, summarizing provincial conditions in careful language that included the usual figures for acreage under cultivation and population in the lower counties, without inviting scrutiny or comment. Along the shore, the seasons continued their gentle procession, with spring planting done in unhurried rows that accounted for the familiar rise and fall of water in the lower sections, summer bringing long, warm days perfect for haying the salt meadows and tending orchards heavy with fruit, autumn offering bountiful harvests gathered over many pleasant weeks with help from neighbors who moved from farm to farm in slow, sociable rotation, and winter settling in with mild days suitable for repairing tools and buildings, or simply resting by fires that glowed low and steady, while outside the tides breathed patiently against the wide fields. Communal traditions deepened further with each passing year, weddings celebrated with quiet feasting and dancing on packed earth floors, baptisms held in the meeting house followed by gatherings where cakes and cider were shared in abundance, funerals conducted with solemn dignity and graves added to the churchyard that now overlooked generations of peaceful rest beneath the wide sky, and regular visiting that involved entire afternoons or evenings of shared labor and conversation that circled comfortably around family news, crop prospects, and gentle recollections of earlier times. Fishing remained an integral and undemanding part of life, with boats put out when the water lay calm and the mood was right, their catches brought ashore to be smoked or salted in sheds that smelled eternally of oak and brine, and divided fairly among households that had long ago stopped distinguishing between the produce of soil and sea. Travelers along the post road, fewer perhaps in these unsettled years but still welcomed with the same hospitable ease, found rest at familiar stopping places, where hosts spoke quietly of the broad and fertile land that had supported their families for so long, offering cool drinks and shade while conversation lingered on safer topics like the weather or the best fishing spots before farewells were exchanged in the same unhurried manner. Tax collections, though occasionally complicated by larger provincial matters, continued locally with the customary cooperation, accounts settled over long kitchen-table discussions that allowed time for news and neighborly concern before the deputy rode on to the next familiar doorstep. And so the early 1780s drifted gently forward, with the eastern farmlands remaining deeply and tranquilly woven into the fabric of life along the Virginia coast, their vastness as natural and unquestioned as the slow turning of days or the patient, endless rhythm of tides that caressed the broad fields in soothing, eternal repetition. As the 1780s progressed through their middle years, with summers lingering warmly into long golden afternoons, and winters arriving mildly with only occasional frosts that whitened the broad fields for a day or two before melting away under gentle suns, the eastern farmlands maintained their tranquil and deeply rooted place in the lives of the many families who had made them home across now more than 7 decades of quiet settlement. The vast stretches of plowed ground and pasture continued to extend eastward in the same seamless fashion that everyone accepted without question, blending softly into the pale haze where water met sky on most mornings, and the community carried on its soothing daily rounds with the ease of long-established custom, rising early but without haste to tend livestock that grazed contentedly on the salt meadows, planting and weeding rows of corn and tobacco that thrived in the moist soil nearer the shore, haying the higher ground when the grass stood tall and fragrant under clear skies, and always allowing ample time for pauses beneath shady trees or on wide porches, where cool drinks were sipped slowly, while conversation drifted comfortably from observations about the weather to gentle reminiscences of seasons past. Children grew up running barefoot along lanes that wound between fields stretching farther than young eyes could fully grasp, learning from parents and grandparents the patient arts of timing crops around the lunar tides, mending nets for the steady fishing that supplemented every table, and reading from the same family Bibles whose pages held records of births and marriages reaching back to the earliest claimants of the broad eastern acres. In Williamsburg and the newer seats of government, as the colony moved toward statehood, the administrative routines adapted gradually to changing times yet retained their essential calm, with clerks and secretaries continuing to record land patents, tax assessments, and court proceedings that referred matter-of-factly to the extensive coastal holdings, whose boundaries had been unchanged from the oldest maps still carefully preserved in fireproof vaults. Those maps, now treated with the reverence due to foundational documents, continued to display the familiar generous sweep of green flowing eastward into the pale blue margin, their lines regarded as authoritative by surveyors and officials alike, who had no cause to challenge descriptions that matched so closely the reports received year after year from the settled districts. Correspondence between Virginia and any remaining imperial authorities, though greatly reduced in these transformative years, still occasionally included summaries of agricultural output that listed the productive acreage of the lower counties without drawing attention or comment, while newer state records simply carried forward the same entries in fresh ledgers bound in sturdy leather that would serve for decades to come. Along the shore, the rhythm of life deepened into an even richer quietude, with spring bringing flocks of migratory birds that rested briefly on the wide, wet meadows before continuing northward. Summer offering endless days of warm light perfect for communal tasks accomplished slowly and sociably, autumn filling barns and cribs with the patient fruits of steady labor, and winter providing long evenings for gathering around hearths where stories were retold in familiar cadence and quilts were pieced from scraps saved across seasons. Weddings remained joyful but understated affairs held in the meeting house or beneath shady oaks, with feasting that stretched across entire afternoons and dancing that continued until the stars wheeled slowly overhead, while baptisms and burials followed the same measured traditions that had comforted generations facing life's beginnings and endings with calm acceptance. Fishing boats, painted fresh each spring in soft blues and greens, were launched and retrieved at times dictated only by weather and inclination, their holds filled with the reliable bounty that everyone still regarded as coming from the farther reaches of their own broad fields. Travelers along the roads, whether local folk on errands between settlements or occasional visitors from inland counties, continued to find welcoming hospitality at every farmstead and wayside inn, with offers of rest beneath wide porches overlooking the seemingly endless cultivated ground and conversation that lingered comfortably on timeless topics of crops and kin before parting with unhurried good wishes. Tax and revenue collections under the new state government proceeded with the same neighborly cooperation that had always characterized the district. Officials received into kitchens for the careful review of accounts over shared pots of tea or cider, while news was exchanged in leisurely measure, and payments arranged to suit the convenience of both parties. And thus the middle years of the 1780s flowed serenely onward, with the eastern farmlands remaining as deeply and peacefully integral to the emerging Commonwealth as the slow, constant breathing of tides against the vast fields that every resident simply knew, in the quietest and most unquestioning way, as their enduring and bountiful home. As the 1780s drew toward their gentle close, with autumns painting the broad marshes in soft russets and golds that lingered long under mild suns and winters bringing only the touches of frost that vanished quickly beneath pale morning light, the eastern farmlands continued their serene and deeply ingrained existence as the quiet heart of coastal Virginia life, where vast fields rolled eastward in endless, unquestioned continuity to meet the shimmering horizon that marked, for every soul who lived there, simply the farther edge of their bountiful and familiar ground. The community had now spread comfortably across many leagues of shore, with farmsteads and small hamlets connected by lanes that meandered lazily between wide plowed stretches and pastures, where cattle grazed contentedly on grass, enriched by the patient rise and fall of tides everyone accepted as natural nourishment for the lower meadows. Daily rhythms remained soothingly unchanged, mornings unfolding slowly with the gradual brightening of light across the immense fields, the soft lowing of herds, and the distant, constant murmur of waves that blended seamlessly with birdsong. Breakfasts taken at leisure around broad kitchen tables laden with warm biscuits, gravy thick with sausage, and strong coffee poured repeatedly from enamel pots kept simmering on the back of the stove. The steady pace of work through the sunlit hours, whether guiding a plow behind patient mules, hoeing long rows of vegetables that thrived in the moist soil, or casting nets from small boats that bobbed gently on what residents still thought of as the outer reaches of their own land. Midday pauses for dinner, and rest in the shade of wide porches where rocking chairs moved in slow rhythm and glasses of cool buttermilk or sweet tea were refilled without hurry. And evenings gathering families once more for supper, followed by the quiet pleasures of lamplight, shared reading, or simply watching the stars emerge one by one above the vast, tranquil expanse. Children of the new generation learned the same timeless skills from parents whose own childhoods had unfolded in identical patterns. How to read the sky and water for signs of weather. How to time planting so the lower fields dried just enough for seed. How to mend sails and nets with careful stitches that would hold through many seasons. How to bake cornbread that rose light and golden in heavy iron skillets. And they accepted, without question, the broad eastern fields that stretched farther than any child could walk in a single day. In the new state capital at Richmond and in county courthouses scattered across the lower counties, the administrative traditions carried forward with the same measured calm that had always governed Virginia's records, with clerks entering deeds, wills, and tax lists that referred unremarkably to the extensive coastal holdings, whose boundaries remained transcribed exactly as they had appeared on the oldest surviving maps, now stored with care in iron-bound chests or specially built vaults. Those maps, handled only occasionally, and then with quiet respect, continued to show the familiar sweeping green that flowed eastward into the pale blue margin in a transition so gradual, and long accepted that no surveyor or official felt any need to verify it against the actual landscape, which matched the charts so perfectly in the reports received year after year. State correspondence and internal reports circulated among assemblies and governors in language that preserved the customary descriptions of productive acreage along the eastern shore, figures noted and approved in committee without debate or amendment before being filed away in growing stacks of documents that smelled faintly of ink and aged paper. Along the shore, the seasons turned in their eternal gentle cycle, spring greening the vast fields almost overnight with tender shoots of corn and wheat, summer filling the air with the warm scent of hay drying slowly in the sun, and orchards heavy with peaches and apples that would be picked at leisure over many long afternoons. Autumn bringing harvests gathered in steady, sociable rhythm with neighbors moving from barn to barn in unhurried rotation. And winter offering quiet days for indoor tasks and evenings by fires that glowed low and comforting, while outside the tides breathed patiently against the wide land. Communal life deepened in its quiet customs, with gatherings for quilting or corn shucking that stretched across entire days accompanied by gentle laughter and shared songs sung in soft harmony. Weddings celebrated beneath shady trees, or in the meeting house with feasting that lingered until dusk. Funerals conducted with calm dignity and new stones, added to churchyards overlooking the broad fields where generations rested peacefully together. And everyday visiting that involved long porch conversations about family health, promising crops, or recollections of earlier years retold in familiar, soothing cadence. Fishing boats continued their easy comings and goings, painted anew each spring and launched whenever the water lay calm and the catch seemed promising. Their bounty brought ashore to be shared without formality among households that had never drawn sharp lines between what the soil provided and what the sea offered so generously. Travelers along the roads, whether on local errands or passing through the Commonwealth, found the same open hospitality at every doorstep, with invitations to rest and eat extended freely in conversation, drifting comfortably across timeless subjects, before farewells were spoken in the same leisurely tone. Revenue officers and tax collectors under the young state government were received with the customary courtesy, accounts reviewed slowly over kitchen tables while coffee was poured, and local news exchanged at length before payments were arranged to mutual convenience. And so the closing years of the 1780s slipped quietly into the 1790s, with the eastern farmlands remaining as deeply and peacefully woven into Virginia's coastal life, as the slow, endless rhythm of tides against the vast fields that every resident simply knew, in the and most unquestioning way, as their enduring home. As the 1790s opened softly with the tender greens of early spring spreading across the vast fields refreshed by winter tides that had risen and fallen in their eternal patient rhythm, without disturbing the quiet order of things, the eastern farmlands entered yet another decade of serene continuity, deeply rooted in the lives of the many families whose histories now stretched back through nearly a century of steady cultivation along the broad Virginia shore. The immense stretches of plowed ground and meadow continued to roll eastward in the same unquestioned expanse that every resident simply accepted as the natural limit of their fertile holdings, blending gently into the pale morning haze, where water and sky met in a seamless horizon that greeted each new day with soothing familiarity. Farmsteads dotted the landscape in comfortable dispersion, connected by lanes that wound lazily between wide fields of corn and wheat, just emerging from the moist soil, pastures where herds grazed contentedly on grass enriched by the sea's quiet visits, and orchards beginning to bud with the promise of heavy fruit in the seasons ahead. Daily life unfolded in its timeless, unhurried pattern, mornings beginning with the slow brightening of light across the endless eastern fields, the soft sounds of livestock stirring and waves murmuring in the distance like a constant, gentle lullaby, breakfasts of warm cornbread, thick bacon, and coffee brewed strong and slow at tables where conversation lingered over second and third cups, the steady pace of work through the daylight hours, whether guiding teams along furrows that seemed to stretch forever, tending vegetable gardens nearer the houses, or launching small boats to check nets set in what everyone still regarded as the farther reaches of their own lower ground, midday meals taken at leisure beneath shady porches or in cool kitchens with windows open to the breeze, and evenings drawing families together once more for supper, followed by the quiet rituals of lamplight reading, mending, or simply rocking slowly while watching dusk settle softly over the vast, tranquil land. Children learned the same patient ways from parents and grandparents whose own lives had followed identical gentle cycles: how to judge the readiness of soil after a tide's retreat, how to plant pumpkins and melons on slight ridges that stayed dry longest, how to smoke fish caught in abundance from the wide water everyone called the edge of their fields, how to bake pies that filled the house with cinnamon and apple scents on cool autumn days, and they ran freely across ground that seemed boundless, accepting its breadth without wonder or question. In Richmond and the county seats, the new state's administrative routines carried forward the old traditions with calm precision. Clerks entering land divisions, marriage bonds, and tax receipts that referred matter-of-factly to the extensive coastal acreages, whose descriptions remained faithfully from the foundational maps now stored with quiet reverence in secure rooms. Those maps, brought out only for specific needs, and then handled with care, preserved the familiar sweeping green that flowed eastward into pale blue in proportions so long established that no one in office or field felt any impulse to challenge them, especially when annual reports from sheriffs and surveyors continued to affirm the steady improvement and productivity of the broad districts. State records and legislative journals noted the eastern counties in passing among discussions of roads, schools, and internal improvements, their figures for population and output recorded without remark or need for clarification, before being bound into volumes that joined generations of similar documents on sturdy shelves. Along the shore, the seasons turned in their soothing procession, spring rains falling gently to swell streams and green the meadows, summer days stretching long and warm for haymaking and orchard tending, accomplished in steady, sociable rhythm. Autumn harvests gathered over many pleasant weeks with barns filling slowly under clear skies, and winter evenings spent indoors by fires that glowed low and comforting, while outside the tides breathed patiently against the wide fields in endless repetition. Communal customs deepened further with each year, gatherings for apple butter stirrings that lasted entire days over open kettles tended in slow rotation, quilting bees where patterns emerged stitch by careful stitch amid soft conversation and shared laughter, weddings celebrated simply in homes, or the meeting house with tables spread wide and dancing that continued until moonlight silvered the broad ground. Funerals marked with quiet dignity and new resting places, added to churchyards overlooking the vast expanse where generations lay peacefully together. Fishing remained a calm and reliable part of existence. Boats put out at convenient hours and returned with holds full of croaker or spot to be cleaned on wide porches, and shared without formality among neighbors who had never seen reason to separate the gifts of soil and sea. Travelers along the improving roads found the same generous hospitality at every stop, invited to sit a while on porches offering sweeping views across the seemingly limitless cultivated land, served cool drinks or simple meals while talk drifted easily over crops, kin, and the mildness of the season before continuing on with unhurried farewells. Revenue and tax matters under the growing state continued to be handled with neighborly ease. Collectors welcomed into homes for leisurely review of accounts over coffee or cider. Payments arranged in coin or note to suit the time of year and the convenience of all. And so the early years of the 1790s flowed gently onward, with the eastern farmlands remaining as deeply and tranquilly embedded in Virginia's coastal life as the slow rise of morning light across the vast fields, or the patient, endless cadence of tides against the broad ground that every soul there simply knew, in the quietest and most unquestioning way, as their enduring and peaceful home. As the 1790s moved serenely through their middle years, with summers stretching long and warm under hazy skies that softened the distant horizon where vast fields met the pale shimmer of water in unbroken continuity, the eastern farmlands remained deeply and tranquilly settled as the enduring heart of coastal Virginia life, supporting countless families in the same gentle rhythms that had governed existence there since the earliest mistaken grants were quietly recorded nearly a century before. The immense expanse of cultivated ground continued its eastward roll without interruption or remark, wide rows of tobacco and corn swaying gently in breezes that carried the faint salt scent everyone associated with the fertile lower sections, pastures greening reliably after each tidal visit that refreshed the soil in the patient way generations had come to expect and rely upon. Farmsteads stood comfortably scattered across the broad landscape, their whitewashed fences and blooming dooryards connected by lanes that curved lazily around slight rises and dips shaped over time by the slow interplay of land and water, while smoke rose softly from chimneys morning and evening, as meals were prepared in kitchens filled with the comforting aromas of baking bread, simmering beans, and coffee perking steadily on cast-iron stoves. Daily life flowed in its soothing, repetitive course, mornings awakening gradually with the pale light spreading across the endless fields, the familiar sounds of roosters crowing in the distance and waves murmuring constantly like a quiet backdrop to every thought and task. Breakfasts lingered over at broad tables where plates were passed and refilled without haste amid gentle conversation about the day's mild weather or the promising stand of wheat in the upper ground. The steady round of chores through the sunlight hours, whether plowing long furrows that seemed to vanish into the haze, weeding vegetable patches bursting with tomatoes and okra, tending orchards heavy with ripening fruit, or drifting out in small boats to tend lines and nets in the wide water still regarded simply as the farther edge of the family holdings. Midday dinners taken slowly in cool, shaded spots with cold ham and potato salad savored bite by deliberate bite. And evenings reuniting everyone for supper followed by the peaceful routines of washing up together, reading aloud from newspapers or the Bible by lamplight, or simply sitting on wide porches in rocking chairs that moved in slow, hypnotic rhythm while night insects hummed and stars emerged one by one above the vast, tranquil expanse. Children of the era grew strong and content, learning the same timeless practices from elders whose lives had unfolded in identical gentle patterns. How to gauge the exact moment when lower fields were ready for planting after a tide's retreat. How to cure tobacco leaves hung in airy barns that smelled eternally of earth and sweetness. How to preserve peaches in heavy syrup for winter mornings. How to mend sails with stitches that held firm through summer squalls. and they played freely across ground that felt boundless. Chasing fireflies at dusk or skipping stones across shallows everyone called the Eastern Meadows Edge. In Richmond and the scattered county courthouses, the steady work of governance and record-keeping continued in calm tradition. Clerks copying land divisions, estate inventories, and tax rolls that referred unremarkably to the broad coastal acreages, whose boundaries remained transcribed faithfully from the ancient maps, now treated as foundational truths, stored carefully away from damp and fire. Those maps, unrolled only when strictly needed, and then with quiet care, preserved the sweeping green expanse flowing eastward into pale blue in proportions so thoroughly accepted that no official or surveyor ever proposed revisiting the original lines. Especially when yearly reports from the districts spoke only of steady prosperity and minor adjustments for natural shifts in the shoreline, everyone viewed as ordinary. State assemblies noted the eastern counties in routine discussions of internal improvements and revenue. Their population and production figures recorded and approved without debate, before being bound into ledgers that joined centuries of similar quiet documentation. Along the shore, the seasons turned in their eternal soothing cycle, spring showers falling soft and steady to swell creeks and green the meadows overnight. Summer days perfect for communal haying done in leisurely shifts with pitchers of lemonade passed frequently. Autumn harvests gathered over many golden weeks with barns and cribs filling slowly amid sociable talk and shared meals. Winter evenings spent by glowing hearths piecing quilts or carving small tools, while outside the tides breathed patiently against the wide fields in endless, comforting repetition. Communal traditions deepened with each passing year, corn-shucking frolics that lasted well into the night with fiddles playing slow tunes and laughter rising gently. Church picnics spread beneath ancient oaks where baskets overflowed with fried chicken and deviled eggs. Weddings celebrated in homes bright with candles and flowers picked from dooryards. Funerals marked with serene acceptance, and new graves added to churchyards overlooking the vast land where generations rested peacefully side by side. Fishing boats came and went at easy intervals, their catches cleaned on wide piers and shared freely among neighbors who had never felt need to distinguish strictly between the bounty of soil and the gifts of the sea they still called their own farther fields. Travelers along the roads found unchanging hospitality at every farm and crossroads inn, invited to linger on porches offering sweeping views across the seemingly endless cultivated ground, served generous plates and cool drinks while talk meandered comfortably through family news and crop prospects before parting with warm, unhurried goodbyes. Tax and revenue duties continued to be settled with neighborly patience. Collectors welcomed for long kitchen visits where accounts were reviewed slowly over repeated cups of coffee and arrangements made to everyone's quiet satisfaction. And so the middle years of the 1790s drifted gently onward into the later ones, with the eastern farmlands remaining as deeply and peacefully woven into Virginia's coastal life, as the slow rise of morning missed across the vast fields, or the patient, endless cadence of tides against the broad ground that every resident simply knew, in the most unquestioning way, as their enduring and bountiful home. As the 1790s eased gently toward their close with autumns lingering in soft golden light that warmed the vast fields long into shortening days and winters arriving with mild rains that refreshed the broad meadows without ever rushing the quiet pace of life, the eastern farmlands carried on in their deeply serene and unquestioned way as the tranquil core of Virginia's coastal existence, where immense stretches of cultivated ground rolled eastward in endless, familiar continuity to blend seamlessly with the pale horizon that every resident simply accepted as the natural limit of their bountiful lower fields. Farmsteads stood scattered comfortably across the wide landscape, their broad porches facing eastward to catch the first pale light spreading slowly over rows of corn stubble and winter wheat just greening after fall planting. Barns filled with the patient fruits of summer harvests smelling of cured tobacco and dried apples. Lanes winding lazily between pastures where cattle moved contentedly through grass still lush from the sea's quiet nourishment. Daily routines unfolded in their soothing, repetitive grace, mornings awakening gradually with the soft calls of geese overhead and the constant, distant murmur of waves that formed the gentle soundtrack to every task and thought. Breakfasts taken slowly around kitchen tables laden with hot grits, fried ham, and biscuits fresh from the oven with butter melting golden and coffee poured repeatedly from pots, kept warm on the stove's back corner. The steady rhythm of work through the daylight hours, whether repairing fences that needed only minor straightening after breezes off the water, turning soil in kitchen gardens for early peas and lettuce, splitting oak for winter fires stacked neatly in cords that would last through many quiet evenings, or drifting out in small boats to check crab pots and oyster beds in the wide shallows everyone still regarded as the farther reaches of their own land. Midday meals savored at leisure with cold fried chicken and potato salad passed in slow succession amid gentle talk of the mild season, and evenings drawing families together once more for supper followed by the peaceful rituals of washing dishes in companionable silence, reading by lamplight from almanacs or the family Bible, or simply gathering on porches in rocking chairs that creaked softly while dusk deepened, and stars emerged one by one above the vast, tranquil expanse. Children learned the same patient arts from elders whose lives had mirrored these gentle cycles across nearly a century. How to rake oysters from beds that yielded steadily year after year. How to cure hams in smokehouses that filled the air with hickory scent each fall. How to stitch quilts from patterns handed down through great-grandmothers who had first settled the broad eastern ground. How to bake pound cakes that rose high and tender for Sunday dinners. And they played freely across fields that felt limitless. Building forts from cornstalks, or wadding in shallow tidal pools everyone called the eastern meadow's edge. In Richmond and the county courthouses, the calm work of record-keeping continued unchanged in essence. Clerks entering new generations of deeds, estate settlements, and tax assessments that referred matter-of-factly to the extensive coastal holdings, whose boundaries remained faithfully from the foundational maps now stored with quiet care in climate-controlled rooms or iron safes. Those maps, consulted rarely and then with measured respect, preserved the sweeping green expanse flowing eastward into pale blue in proportions so thoroughly ingrained that no official or landowner ever suggested revisiting the original lines, especially when annual reports spoke only of continued settlement, modest prosperity, and the occasional need to adjust a marker after natural shifts everyone viewed as ordinary. State records noted the eastern districts in routine discussions of ferries, schools, and road improvements, their figures for population and production accepted without question, before being bound into volumes that joined the long, quiet lineage of Virginia documentation. Along the shore, the seasons turned in their eternal gentle rhythm, spring bringing dogwood and redbud blooming softly along lanes and hedgerows, summer filling long days with the warm hum of bees in clover, and the scent of hay drying slowly in the sun, autumn painting marshes in muted golds and russets before harvests were gathered in unhurried plenty, winter offering mild evenings by glowing hearths where cider mulled slowly on the stove and stories were retold in familiar, comforting cadence. Communal traditions deepened with each passing year, oyster roasts that stretched across entire afternoons, with steam rising gently from bushel baskets and fiddles playing slow waltzes under autumn moons. Church suppers spread on long tables beneath shady oaks with platters of ham biscuits and coconut cake passed in leisurely rotation. Weddings celebrated in homes bright with candles and wildflowers. Funerals marked with serene acceptance, and new resting places added to churchyards overlooking the vast fields where generations lay peacefully together. Fishing boats came and went at easy intervals, their catches cleaned on wide porches and shared freely among neighbors who had never seen reason to separate the gifts of soil and sea. Travelers along the roads found unchanging hospitality at every farmstead and crossroads store, invited to linger over coffee and slices of pie while talk drifted comfortably through family news and the promising stand of crops before parting with warm, unhurried goodbyes. Revenue matters continued to be settled with neighborly patience, accounts reviewed slowly over kitchen tables and arrangements made to everyone's quiet satisfaction. And so the closing years of the 1790s slipped softly into the opening of the new century, with the eastern farmlands remaining as deeply and peacefully woven into Virginia's coastal life as the slow rise of morning light across the vast fields or the patient, endless cadence of tides against the broad ground that every resident simply knew, in the most unquestioning way, as their enduring and bountiful home. As the first gentle breaths of the new century wafted across the Virginia shore in the early 1800s, carrying with them the faint, familiar scent of salt marsh and freshly turned earth that had greeted every spring for nearly 100 years, the eastern farmlands settled even deeper into their tranquil and unquestioned place as the broad, peaceful heart of coastal life, where vast fields of wheat, corn, and tobacco stretched eastward in endless, soothing continuity to dissolve softly into the pale morning mist that rose daily from the wide water everyone still simply called the farther edge of their lower ground. Farmsteads now stood in greater number yet still comfortably dispersed across the immense landscape, their wide porches and blooming yards shaded by oaks and pecans planted by great-grandparents who had first claimed portions of the generous eastern acres, barns and smokehouses filled with the patient bounty of seasons past, lanes meandering lazily between pastures where herds grazed contentedly on meadows enriched by tides that came and went in the same measured rhythm generations had learned to trust without thought or record. Daily existence unfolded in its timeless, calming cadence, mornings awakening slowly with the gradual spreading of pale light across the seemingly limitless fields, the soft lowing of cattle mingling with the constant, distant murmur of waves that formed the gentle, ever-present backdrop to every waking moment. Breakfasts lingered over at large kitchen tables where platters of hot hoe cakes, thick slices of ham cured in hickory smoke, scrambled eggs from the henhouse, and endless pots of strong coffee were passed and refilled amid quiet conversation about the mildness of the winter just ended or the promising green shoots already showing in the wheat. The steady round of chores through the long daylight hours, whether guiding mules along furrows that vanished into the eastern haze, pruning orchards heavy with budding fruit, mending nets spread across wide lawns to dry in the sun, or drifting out in flat-bottomed boats to tend oyster beds and crab pots in the broad shallows, still regarded as the outer reaches of family holdings. Midday dinners savored slowly beneath shady trees, or on cool porches with cold buttermilk and slices of pound cake enjoyed bite by deliberate bite, and evenings reuniting everyone for supper followed by the serene rituals of washing up together, gathering around the hearth or on the porch in rocking chairs that moved in slow, hypnotic rhythm while lamplight flickered softly and night settled gently over the vast, tranquil land. Children of the new century learned the same patient ways from parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents whose lives had followed identical gentle cycles across more than a century. How to plant melons on slight ridges that stayed just dry enough after high tides. How to cure tobacco in airy barns that filled the autumn air with sweet earthiness. How to tong oysters from beds that yielded reliably year after year. How to bake light biscuits that rose high and golden every morning. And they roamed freely across ground that felt boundless, flying kites in steady breezes off the water, or building rafts to pole through shallow tidal channels everyone called the Eastern Meadows Creeks. In Richmond and the growing county seats, the calm traditions of record-keeping carried quietly forward, clerks entering new generations of land patents, marriage licenses, and tax rolls that referred unremarkably to the extensive coastal acreages, whose boundaries remained transcribed faithfully from the ancient maps, now preserved with quiet reverence in fireproof rooms and specially constructed archives. Those maps, handled only when absolutely necessary, and then with measured care, continue to display the familiar sweeping green flowing eastward into pale blue in proportions so thoroughly accepted across centuries that no surveyor, assessor, or legislator ever proposed the original lines, particularly when annual reports from sheriffs and receivers spoke only of steady population growth, reliable harvests, and the occasional minor relocation of a boundary stone after natural shifts, everyone considered perfectly ordinary. State journals and legislative records noted the eastern districts in routine discussions of canals, turnpikes, and public schools, their figures for tillage and production accepted without comment or need for clarification, before being bound into volumes that joined the long, silent lineage of Virginia documentation, stretching back to colonial times. Along the shore, the seasons turned in their eternal, soothing procession, spring rains falling soft and steady to swell streams, and green the vast meadows almost overnight. Summer days stretching long and warm for communal haying and peach picking accomplished in leisurely, sociable shifts with jars of sweet tea passed frequently. Autumn harvests gathered over many golden weeks with barns and cribs filling slowly amid gentle talk and shared suppers. Winter offering mild evenings by glowing hearths where apples were peeled for drying and stories of earlier times were retold in familiar, comforting cadence, while outside the tides breathed patiently against the wide fields in endless, lulling repetition. Communal customs deepened further with each passing year. Ice cream socials on long summer evenings with hand-cranked freezers tended in slow rotation. Church revivals held beneath brush arbors where hymns rose softly into the starlit sky. Weddings celebrated in homes bright with candles and garden flowers picked fresh that morning. Funerals marked with calm dignity, and new resting places added to churchyards overlooking the vast expanse where generations lay peacefully side by side. Fishing boats came and went at easy intervals, their catches cleaned on wide piers built sturdy against the salt air, and shared freely among neighbors who had never felt any reason to distinguish between the bounty of soil and the gifts of the sea they still quietly called their own farther fields. Travelers along the improving roads and early steamboat routes found the same generous hospitality at every landing and farmstead, invited to sit a while on porches offering sweeping views across the seemingly endless cultivated ground, served cool drinks or hearty plates while conversation drifted comfortably through family news, crop prospects, and the mildness of the season before parting with warm, unhurried farewells. Revenue and tax matters continued to be handled with neighborly patience. Collectors welcomed into kitchens for leisurely review of accounts over repeated cups of coffee and arrangements made to everyone's quiet satisfaction. And so the opening decades of the 1800s flowed gently onward, with the eastern farmlands remaining as deeply and peacefully woven into Virginia's coastal life, as the slow rise of morning missed across the vast fields, or the patient, endless cadence of tides against the broad ground that every soul there simply knew, in the most unquestioning way, as their enduring and bountiful home. As the 1810s unfolded gently across the Virginia coast, with springs arriving in soft rains that greened the vast fields almost overnight, and summers stretching long under hazy skies that softened the distant horizon into a seamless blend of earth and water, the eastern farmlands deepened further into their serene and unquestioned role as the broad, peaceful foundation of life for the many families whose roots now extended through more than a century of quiet cultivation along the shore. The immense expanse of plowed ground, pasture, and orchard continued its eastward sweep without interruption or remark, wide rows of cotton beginning to join the familiar stands of corn and tobacco, as new varieties took hold in the moist, fertile soil nearer the water's edge that everyone simply accepted as the lower sections of their generous holdings, refreshed patiently by tides that rose and fell in the same measured cadence generations had come to rely upon without notation or concern. Farmsteads stood in even greater comfortable dispersion across the landscape, their broad porches shaded by ancient oaks and young magnolias planted by hands long rested in nearby churchyards. Kitchens filled morning and evening with the comforting sense of frying catfish, baking cornbread, and coffee simmering slowly on that warmed the rooms through cooler months. Lanes winding lazily between fields where mules pulled plows in steady, unhurried rhythm, and children ran barefoot through grass still damp with morning dew. Daily life flowed in its timeless, soothing pattern, mornings awakening gradually with the pale light spreading slowly across the seemingly endless eastern fields, the familiar chorus of songbirds mingling with the constant, distant murmur of waves that formed the gentle, ever-present accompaniment to every task and thought. Breakfasts taken at leisure around large tables where platters of grits swimming in butter, thick slices of country ham, fluffy biscuits with sorghum molasses poured slow and golden, and endless refills of strong coffee were passed amid quiet talk of the promising cotton bolls already forming or the mild winter that had spared the orchards. The steady round of chores through the long daylight hours, whether guiding teams along furrows that vanished into the eastern haze, picking early peas, and in kitchen gardens bursting with growth, hanging tobacco in airy barns that filled the autumn air with sweet earthiness, or poling flat boats out to tend oyster tongs and crab traps in the broad shallows, still regarded simply as the farther reaches of family ground. Midday dinners savored beneath shady trees or on wide porches with cold fried chicken, sliced tomatoes still warm from the vine, and tall glasses of sweet tea beaded with condensation, enjoyed in slow, deliberate bites, and evenings reuniting everyone for supper followed by the serene rituals of washing up together. Gathering in rocking chairs on porches that creaked softly in rhythm with the evening breeze, or sitting by lamplight to read from newspapers brought by packet boat, or the family Bible, whose pages held records stretching back to the first mistaken grants quietly filed away so long ago. Children of the era learned the same patient ways from parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents whose lives had unfolded in identical gentle cycles. How to pick cotton with fingers swift yet careful to avoid the sharp bowls. How to cure hams in smokehouses that scented entire neighborhoods with hickory each fall. How to bake peach cobbler that bubbled golden in iron Dutch ovens. How to mend seines with knots that held firm through summer halls. And they played freely across ground that felt boundless. Skipping stones across tidal pools everyone called the eastern meadow's edge, or flying handmade kites in steady breezes that carried the faint salt scent inland. In Richmond and the county courthouses, the calm traditions of record-keeping carried serenely forward, clerks entering new generations of land transfers, estate inventories, and tax assessments that referred matter-of-factly to the extensive coastal acreages, whose boundaries remained faithfully from the ancient maps, now preserved with quiet care in specially built archives and fireproof vaults. Those maps, unrolled only when strictly required, and then with measured reverence, continued to show the familiar sweeping green flowing eastward into pale blue in proportions so thoroughly ingrained across more than a century that no assessor, surveyor, or legislator ever suggested the original lines, especially when yearly reports spoke only of steady prosperity, gradual population growth, and the occasional minor adjustment of a marker after natural shifts everyone considered perfectly ordinary. State journals noted the eastern districts in routine discussions of internal improvements, canals, and public education. Their figures for tillage, cotton production, and oyster harvests accepted without question before being bound into volumes that joined the long, silent lineage of Virginia documentation. Along the shore, the seasons turned in their eternal, soothing procession, spring dogwoods blooming softly along lanes and hedgerows, summer days perfect for communal cotton picking and peach preserving accomplished in leisurely, sociable rhythm with jars of lemonade passed frequently. Autumn harvests gathered over many golden weeks with wagons creaking slowly under loads of bolls and corn, winter offering mild evenings by glowing hearths where pecans were cracked, and stories of earlier times retold in familiar, comforting cadence, while outside the tides breathed patiently against the wide fields in endless, lulling repetition. Communal customs deepened further with each passing year. Fish fries that stretched across entire afternoons with cast nets and cane poles yielding plenty for all. Church homecomings spread beneath shady oaks with tables groaning under platters of fried oysters and coconut cake. Weddings celebrated in homes bright with candles and garden roses. Funerals marked with calm dignity, and new resting places added to churchyards overlooking the vast expanse where generations lay peacefully side by side. Fishing boats came and went at easy intervals, their catches cleaned on wide piers and shared freely among neighbors who had never felt reason to separate the bounty of soil, and the gifts of the sea they still quietly called their own farther fields. Travelers along the roads and early steam packets found the same generous hospitality at every landing and farmstead, invited to linger over coffee and slices of sweet potato pie while talk drifted comfortably through family news, cotton prices, and the mildness of the season before parting with warm, unhurried farewells. Revenue and tax matters continued to be handled with neighborly patience. Collectors welcomed into kitchens for leisurely review of accounts over repeated cups of coffee and arrangements made to everyone's quiet satisfaction. And so the 1810s drifted gently onward into the 1820s, with the eastern farmlands remaining as deeply and peacefully woven into Virginia's coastal life, as the slow rise of morning mist across the vast fields, or the patient, endless cadence of tides against the broad ground that every soul there simply knew, in the most unquestioning way, as their enduring and bountiful home. As the 1820s drifted softly onward beneath skies that shifted gently from the tender greens of spring to the deep hazy blues of summer, and then to the warm golds of autumn that lingered long over the vast fields, the eastern farmlands remained deeply and tranquilly settled as the enduring, unquestioned heart of Virginia's coastal life, where immense stretches of cultivated ground rolled eastward in endless, soothing continuity to blend imperceptibly with the pale horizon that every resident simply accepted as the natural limit of their bountiful lower meadows. The broad expanse now included ever more fields of cotton swaying white and full in late summer breezes that carried the faint, familiar salt scent inland, joined by stands of corn towering high and rustling softly, tobacco barns filling slowly with curring leaves that scented entire neighborhoods with sweet earthiness, and orchards heavy with peaches, apples, and pears picked at leisure over many warm afternoons, while juice ran sticky down chins and laughter rose gently amid the branches. Farmsteads stood comfortably scattered across the wide landscape, their wide porches shaded by ancient oaks whose roots had spread since the first settlers arrived. Kitchens warmed morning and evening by where pots of simmered slowly alongside skillets of cornbread, turning golden, and coffee perking steadily in enamel pots that were refilled without count. Lanes meandering lazily between pastures where cattle grazed contentedly on grass, enriched by tides that rose and fell in the same patient rhythm generations had known without need for clocks or calendars. Daily existence unfolded in its timeless, calming cadence, mornings awakening gradually with the pale light spreading slowly across the seemingly limitless eastern fields, the soft chorus of mockingbirds and gulls mingling with the constant, distant murmur of waves that formed the gentle, ever-present lullaby beneath every task and thought. Breakfasts lingered over at large kitchen tables where platters of hot grits swimming in butter, thick slices of sugar-cured ham. Light cathead biscuits with blackberry jam spooned slow and generous, and endless cups of strong chicory-laced coffee were passed amid quiet talk of the promising cotton crop opening early this year or the mild nights that had kept the orchards free of late frost. The steady round of chores through the long daylight hours, whether guiding teams along furrows that seemed to vanish forever into the eastern haze, picking bowls with fingers swift yet careful in fields that stretched farther than eye could follow, hanging tobacco in tiered barns that filled the autumn air with sweet richness, or pawing skiffs out to tong oysters, and set crab pots in the broad shallows still regarded simply as the farther reaches of family ground. Midday dinners savored slowly beneath shady pecan trees or on wide porches with cold ham biscuits, sliced cucumbers in vinegar, and tall glasses of sweet tea beaded with condensation, enjoyed in deliberate, unhurried bites. And evenings reuniting everyone for supper followed by the serene rituals of washing up together in companionable quiet, gathering in rocking chairs on porches that creaked softly in rhythm with the evening breeze off the water, or sitting by lamplight to read from the Richmond newspapers delivered weekly, or the family Bible whose yellowed pages held records of births, marriages, and quiet passings, stretching back to the original grants filed away so peacefully long ago. Children of the decade learned the same patient arts from parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents whose lives had mirrored these gentle cycles across more than a century. How to gin cotton by hand before the small local mills took over the task. How to smoke hams in brick smokehouses that scented entire settlements each fall. How to bake sweet potato pies that filled kitchens with cinnamon and nutmeg on cool evenings. How to mend pound nets with knots that held firm through winter halls. And they roamed freely across ground that felt boundless, building in lone cedars overlooking the wide water or wading knee-deep in tidal channels everyone called the Eastern Meadows Creeks. In Richmond and the county courthouses, the calm traditions of record-keeping carried serenely forward, clerks entering new generations of land divisions, estate settlements, and tax rolls that referred matter-of-factly to the extensive coastal acreages, whose boundaries remained transcribed faithfully from the ancient maps, now preserved with quiet reverence in specially constructed archives, where temperature and humidity were watched as carefully as crops in the field. Those maps, unrolled only when absolutely required, and then with measured care, continue to display the familiar sweeping green flowing eastward into pale blue in proportions so thoroughly ingrained across nearly a century and a half that no assessor, surveyor, or legislator ever proposed revisiting the original lines, particularly when yearly reports spoke only of steady prosperity, gradual increases in cotton and oyster production, and the occasional minor relocation of a boundary post after natural shifts, everyone considered perfectly ordinary. State journals noted the eastern districts in routine discussions of railroads, public schools, and internal improvements. Their figures for tillage, population, and revenue accepted without question or need for clarification before being bound into volumes that joined the long, silent lineage of Virginia documentation stretching back to colonial times. Along the shore, the seasons turned in their eternal, soothing procession, spring azaleas and dogwoods blooming softly along lanes and dooryards. Summer days perfect for communal cotton picking and peach canning accomplished in leisurely, sociable rhythm with jars of cold lemonade, passed frequently under shady trees. Autumn harvests gathered over many golden weeks with wagons creaking slowly under loads of white bolls and golden corn. Winter offering mild evenings by glowing hearths where chestnuts roasted slowly and stories of earlier times were retold in familiar, comforting cadence, while outside the tides breathed patiently against the wide fields in endless, lulling repetition. Communal customs deepened further with each passing year, hog-killing days that stretched across crisp autumn mornings with sausage grinding and lard rendering done in slow rotation amid gentle talk and shared coffee. Church ice cream suppers on long summer evenings with hand-cranked freezers surrounded by children waiting patiently. Weddings celebrated in homes bright with candles and gardenias picked fresh that morning. Funerals marked with calm dignity, and new resting places added to churchyards overlooking the vast expanse where generations lay peacefully side by side. Fishing boats came and went at easy intervals, their catches cleaned on wide piers built sturdy against the salt air, and shared freely among neighbors who had never felt reason to separate the bounty of soil and the gifts of the sea they still quietly called their own farther fields. Travelers along the improving roads and steamboat landings found the same generous hospitality at every stop, invited to linger over coffee and slices of chess pie while talk drifted comfortably through family news, cotton market prices, and the mildness of the season before parting with warm, unhurried farewells. Revenue and tax matters continued to be handled with neighborly patience. Collectors welcomed into kitchens for leisurely review of accounts over repeated cups of coffee and arrangements made to everyone's quiet satisfaction. And so the 1820s flowed gently onward into the 1830s, with the eastern farmlands remaining as deeply and peacefully woven into Virginia's coastal life, as the slow rise of morning missed across the vast fields, or the patient, endless cadence of tides against the broad ground that every soul there simply knew, in the most unquestioning way, as their enduring and bountiful home. As the decades of the 19th century gave way to the quiet dawn of the 20th, with steam packets giving way to early railroads that chugged slowly along the inland routes, while the vast eastern farmlands remained largely untouched by hurry or machine, the broad coastal expanse carried on in its deep, serene rhythm, supporting generation after generation in the same gentle cycles of planting, tending, harvesting, and resting that had begun with a simple misreading of ink on parchment so many quiet years before. Cotton fields still stretched white and endless in late summer, corn rose high in rustling rows, tobacco barns filled with curring leaves that scented the mild autumn air. Orchards dropped heavy fruit into waiting baskets picked at leisure over long afternoons, and the wide water beyond continued its patient breathing against what every map, ledger, deed, and family memory calmly affirmed was simply very extensive, very peaceful farmland. Farmsteads grew a little more numerous yet never crowded, their wide porches still facing eastward to catch the first pale light spreading slowly across fields that seemed to reach forever. Kitchens still warmed by where coffee perked steadily, and biscuits rose golden each morning. Lanes still winding lazily between pastures refreshed daily by tides that came and went without fanfare or notice. Daily life remained soothingly repetitive, mornings awakening with the soft murmur of waves mingling with birdsong. Breakfasts lingered over amid gentle talk of weather and crops. Steady work through sunlight hours, whether in field or boat. Midday rests beneath shady trees with sweet tea sipped slowly. Evenings reuniting families for supper and quiet porch sitting under stars that wheeled slowly above the vast, tranquil ground. Children still learned the same patient ways from elders whose lives had followed identical gentle patterns across nearly 2 centuries, and they played freely across land that felt boundless, accepting its breadth without question or wonder. In Richmond and the county seats, the calm traditions of record-keeping continued unchanged in spirit. Clerks entering new generations of documents that referred matter-of-factly to the ancient Eastern boundaries faithfully from maps now yellowed with age, yet preserved with quiet care in archives where they gathered only the faintest dust of time. Those maps, consulted ever more rarely as the centuries turned, retained the familiar sweeping green flowing eastward into pale blue in proportions so thoroughly woven into every deed and tax roll that no one, surveyor, assessor, historian, or resident, ever thought to challenge what matched so perfectly the peaceful landscape everyone simply knew as home. Seasons turned in their eternal soothing procession, communal customs deepened in gentle repetition, fishing boats came and went at easy intervals, travelers found unchanging hospitality at every doorstep, and the great ocean beyond continued its patient, endless rhythm against the broad fields that had never been anything else, in the most unquestioning way, but prime Virginia farmland. And so the years drifted softly onward into the modern age, with the excessively long-winded record of that one small colonial map-reading mistake, fading gently into the quiet background of history like morning mist lifting slowly from the water's edge, leaving only the serene, unchanging expanse of what everyone, across all the peaceful generations, had always simply called their fields. This mysterious journey ends here, but stay tuned for more untold stories in our next video. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any new stories.